Top of the morning to ya! I know, it probably sounded terrible. And it's not even morning where I am. And who cares if it's morning where you are? Top of the whatever time of day it is for you. Felcha. We'll leave it at that. What are we going to talk about today? Well, today we're getting racial.
Race?
Just kidding. I want to discuss my DNA. Let's put it on the table. Let's talk about it. Let's strip it down. And let's see how, if it even, says anything about my practice and my thoughts about it. And let's get into it. Let's just do it. I figured, why not? Let's just do it. It'll be fun. So y'all, we're about to dissect a witch's DNA. A queer witch's DNA. Some of you are probably thinking, wait, why does this matter? Why is this important? It's not. It's not important. It's just interesting to me. I think a lot of us as witches are very curious about where we come from and why we are the way we are. I think a lot of us are within that realm of feeling different, within that realm of weird. And at least for me, ever since I was a kid and being, loving witchy stuff and magic-y stuff, I've always been curious about it. Let's just see if my DNA has any explanation for that. DNA, from a scientific standpoint, explains a lot of things, like, are we athletic? Are we going to have curly hair? Are we going to go bald in the future? Is our hair going to be a certain color? Are our eyes going to be a certain color? Are we more likely to have stress factors or trauma reactions? That sort of thing. And so I thought, why not take a standpoint and compare my DNA, because I recently bit the bullet, and Ancestry.com, of which I've been a member since, I don't know, roughly 2010. Roughly as long as I've actually been on YouTube, which is kind of coincidental as well. Interesting. Spent some money to do the DNA thing because I was curious about what the DNA would say. Even though I kind of have asked a lot of questions about my heritage and where we've come from, I was lucky enough to get quite a few good answers because some of the elders in the family have been interested in that as well. I figured this would be kind of a concrete way to do it, and also it would be interesting to compare my path and my interests with this, because, when it comes down to the deities that I work with, and when it comes to people who ask me, what deities should I work with, I often offer the advice of, well, look at your ancestors. Who are your ancestors? Who did they work with? Ask your ancestors who would be a good deity for you to work with. Only because that's what I did. There's totally other ways to do things, and not saying that any one way is right or wrong, but that's just how I did it. That's how I continue to move forward in my path. And so here we are. I've been practicing since 2004, so it's been 20 years. Hi. Oh my God, it's been 20 years. Anyway, back to this video. We'll start with some of the ancestry tidbits that I've come across orally or by word of mouth from mi familia. I was born in Ohio. I grew up in southern Ohio most of my life. actually. And I actually didn't even move from Southern Ohio until I was an adult. With that being said, I have a lot of ancestor roots where I actually was raised. From a medium perspective, being able to visit locations that your great-grandparents physically stepped in or physically interacted with as you are physically interacting with them. You know, it's kind of a weird but also magical thing in and of itself. My dad's family specifically were very prominent in the area that I was raised in. My mom's side of the family is from kind of elsewhere, and we'll kind of get into that. But I guess I started being curious about where I came from back when I was getting really into magic and getting into, like, as a kid, like getting into magical movies and getting into like Halloween Town, and it was like the 90s, and I was in Southern Ohio, and I was, you know, I had cable for the first time. I was probably at least, I was in third grade. I want to say I was definitely in third grade. I was probably around 7 or 8, maybe 9. I think that age, I'll probably look back on this and realize that it's wrong because I'm bad at math. I was young, right? Knew nothing about witchcraft. This was pre-witchcraft, pre-adult Nathan. So we are strictly looking at the views of childhood Blue Night. So I'm in school, I'm watching movies like Halloween Town. Harry Potter wasn't a thing yet. Oh, I was watching So Weird, which loved that show, still love that show. And if you guys haven't seen So Weird, definitely get Disney Plus, go watch So Weird. Fabulous. So Weird was my first, like, ooh, this is me. I am this person. This is me. I am vibing with this. It was like the kids' version of X-Files. It involved, they covered aliens, Bigfoot, witchcraft, ghosts, as they, using their terminology, ghosts, gremlins. I mean, lots of things, right? And it was basically about this girl named Fee who traveled the country with her family being her older brother and her mom. Her dad had passed away when she was very young, and her mom was from Ireland. Her grandparents still lived in Ireland, and there were a few episodes that covered her Irish ancestry. So, like, I was already knew about some Irish, like, just a sprinkle of Irish history and Irish American history, I guess, in that. I also remember, like, for some reason in the 90s, the Irish were banging. They were, like, on top of the world. Like, you had Bewitched, the girl singing group, which was, like, a bop.
People say I look like me dad. What is it?
Amazing. Loved them. Around the same time, I would have cousins that would visit during the summers. They would come from the city and they would visit us in the country. And one of my cousins gave me my first cassette, I guess is what you would call it. Tape. We just called it a tape back then. But, and it was Bewitched because she knew I loved Bewitched, the singing group. So she gave me a Bewitched tape and I loved it. And they were from Ireland. So yeah, So Weird. Like, I was just like, I love this girl. I vibe with her, you know, Bewitched. And then the movie, I'll never forget, the movie Luck of the Irish.
Kyle learned a secret about his family. It changed his life.
You look shorter too?
By about 3 feet.
You mean I'm a leprechaun too?
I watched it for like the first time on Disney Channel. Again, another movie, Disney. Maybe Disney is the gateway drug to witchcraft. I don't know. I'm not a professional. And actually, while we're sitting here talking about this, let me just say that when I talk about history and all of that, I am not a professional. Much of this is just information that I've picked up on. So if I'm incorrect, by all means, let me know. Let me know in the chat. Call me out, because I'm not a professional. This ain't my job. I don't get paid to do this. I'm just talking about my experience, so don't hate on me. Thanks. But I watched Luck of the Irish for the first time, and my mom was present, and I was like, Mom, oh my gosh, I wish we were Irish. Like, this culture is like awesome. I mean, obviously I didn't use the word culture, but I was like, oh my gosh, I wish we were Irish. Like, these people seem so cool. They seem so awesome, and they have such weird accents, and I love it. Like, it just speaks to my heart, and I want to learn how to river dance. I told my mom I wanted to learn how to river dance. And she goes, well, Nathan, you are Irish. Your grandparents were from Ireland. And I was like, what? And she was like, yeah, your papa was Irish. Like, my maiden name is Conley. Like, you have Irish in you. And I was like,
What the fuck?
And then my ADHD little child brain just imploded. I was, you told me at this point that I won the lottery.
Think you can stop what we do? I doubt it.
This was a similarity to my favorite character on my favorite show, Fee. I am Fee. I am weird. I'm into weird stuff, and you know, I experience weird stuff, and also I'm Irish. Like, this can't be a coincidence. This is crazy, right? This is insane. My little brain went down a rabbit hole. I was Irish. The next day, I went to school, and I was like, I'm Irish.
Do you see the like on my merch, Mike?
What's the quickest way to killing a scully, boss?
You coming with us?
I am Irish, which I get it. Like, that there's a problem with saying that. Like, I'm aware as an adult. But come on, I was like 7, 8, 9. I knew where I came from, y'all. I knew my heritage. And I was just like, I'm Irish. I'm Irish now. This is my life.
I'll punch it.
Hey, really quick, this is Editing Nathan, and I just wanted to say really quick that just because I'm talking about Irish and I'm making jokes and all of that, I want to make sure that I want to make it very clear that I understand that, and I want everybody else to understand in this video, that I am not trying to claim myself as an Irish person or as an Irish pagan or anything like that. I am my own American melting pot of traditional, non-traditional bullshittery when it comes to witchcraft. And again, I am not a professional. I am not a high priest of any tradition and all of that. And I want to make sure that I preference that before anybody comes for me in the chat. So yeah, just a heads up. I quickly found out that it was just my mom's side that were Irish, because I'd go to like my grandparent on my father's side, on my paternal side, and was quickly like, we are not Irish. You're not Irish. You must get that from your mom. But the only thing I could really get from my paternal side was Germanic ancestry, as far as like speaking. So the only grandparent I had on my paternal side during my early adult life and later childhood that I could talk to about my heritage was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. And she never really shared a lot about her side of the family. It was very much just paternal grandfather focused, which I thought was interesting. So this is Granny, right? This is who you guys have probably heard me talk about, Granny. who taught me a lot about herbs in Southern Ohio, who, practiced the granny magic. I learned as an adult that she read tea leaves, and, she told me about how her aunt saved her life with her knowledge of herbs, and because she got really sick and almost died, and her aunt saved her with a brew that she had made from some sort of plant out in the woods, and who lived during most of her adult life. She lived on her family's land, which still belongs to the family, still belongs to my dad now. But it was all about my paternal grandfather and how he, they came from Germany. And I grew up knowing that that side of the family was very young to the States. They hadn't been in the States for very long. And for most of my life as an adult, I thought it was 3 or 4 generations, Well, I've been doing more digging now, and the DNA as well, but mostly digging because, if you want to learn about your ancestors, you'll find that it's very intuitive. I'm pretty lucky that my name is pretty rare. At least my paternal side's names are very rare, and they haven't been in the States for very long. So it's a little easier for me to track down that lineage. Also, there's quite a few people in that side of the family who have also done research, hashtag not sponsored. But with Ancestry.com, if any of your relatives or anybody who may be indirectly related to you has done the work, then they show you, hey, this is a potential match. You're potentially related to this person. And, would you like to connect or adopt some of their work? It makes things lots easier. It's also really cool because this is how you get pictures and stuff like that of ancestors. Which, by the way, if any of my relatives are watching, or if any of my relatives know who has the first Cornelius, you'll know who I'm talking about. If any of you have Cornelius's photo, the little print stamp, old-fashioned photo, I would love a copy of that. Just a copy. So, my email's attached. You can DM me on Facebook or whatever. So that'd be great. I'd love you so much. Thanks. I know it exists because Granny had a copy and she would not let me take a copy. I'm telling you, she was weird. She was weird. And it's not talking ill about the dead, if it's true. So there's that. She was just weird with it. But anyway, I digress. So, German, Irish. That's what I had to work with. I was like, oh, okay, German, Irish. Okay. Which is common in America, right? It's not there's not a lot of people with that, mix. You know what I'm saying? So, I'm just I'm white. I get it. It's whatever. So, I get into witchcraft, start with Wicca, work my way out of Wicca, and into just developing my own thing. And then I'm still keeping, deity to a distance, because I'm still organized religion, giving names to deities, something that we as humans can't really comprehend. Just keeping that, I don't know, I just didn't feel comfortable. Which I talk about religious trauma in my last video, so we'll put that up. Please take a look at that if you're interested. So, through meditations and stuff, and through my practice as an adult, because as an adult, I had more freedom with developing an actual practice in witchcraft. All of my research started off online because, I grew up in a small town. There weren't a lot of resources available at the public library as far as books go, and there weren't a lot of books out there, at least nowhere near as many as there are now. I instantly developed an at-home with the Celtic symbolism because I was already at home with being Irish German from what I was told. My practice reflected that already, because I was like, this is what my ancestors probably did. As I'm developing a practice as an adult, because I have more freedom, I come across the Morrigan. And at first I was hearing her name a lot, and I was like, no, I'm not gonna work with her because without even knowing a lot about her, I just knew she's a goddess of war and she's popular. And we've covered this before, right? I was very much like, that's a bandwagon, and I'm not jumping on that bandwagon. And I really didn't understand why she was a bandwagon. So, come to find out, it's because she's an Irish goddess, and a lot of people probably are called by her because they have Irish ancestry, and she's a pretty loud goddess. She likes to be listened to. She likes to be heard. I'm working with the Morrigan, which eventually leads me to the Dagda, her husband, as they say, or as some people say. And again, let me remind you that I'm not a historian. I am not a professional by any means. Even later in life, I should say. I've also been pulled towards Viking studies and work, which is another thing that I kind of held at a distance because I was like, I don't love the idea that everybody loves Vikings. And also, I'm going to be completely honest, don't love the fact that a lot of Viking symbolism has been recycled by neo-Nazi or racists in general, just the Volknut being the first one that comes to mind. Don't really love that idea, and this is just stuff that comes across my mind as an uneducated person when it comes to these things. And I really had to look into it, and what really made me really look into it was thinking, well, I don't really know about my paternal grandmother's side. I don't really know about my maternal grandmother's side, and to me, DNA is DNA. Like, you get half and half. You get half from both sides, right? So, to me, it's all important. It's all a part of me. Like, it all somehow, mathematically, by the will of nature, became me as I am. So, if we're going to think about witch blood, which is a hot topic lately, being something that is passed down via DNA, we have to consider that, if the witch DNA, or if there is a witch DNA, which, by the way, is insane. Like, there is no witch DNA. That we're not. I'm not getting into that, okay? We're not getting into that today. But I'll put a really good video from Jasmine Ambrosia's channel with Nathan King that they recently did. It was a live video regarding his book, Awakening the Witch Blood. That's a good conversation. Look at that video. Basically, if in theory we were to entertain that, then we would have to look at all of it, regardless, right? And here's the other thing that I believe, okay? And this is just my personal belief. But if witch blood, or if witch DNA, if we were going to discuss that, if we were going to entertain that idea that it's something that is traced down through bloodlines or whatever, then everybody has it, regardless. Because if you go back in time far enough, everybody practiced magic. Magic was the first thing that came about from a human spiritual perspective. I mean, like attracts like, our ancient ancestors were dancing around fires in animal skins, playing out a successful hunt for stories, but also an entertainment, but also to have successful hunts. Like, this is just something that I think most historians agree on. And we, as people being alive today, obviously are relatives of those ancient people. Everybody who's alive today can trace their lineage back to those ancient people, because those ancient people, right? You get what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm putting together here? Is like, everybody at one point practiced some form of magic, so it's just a matter of how far back you go. And, like, what's it matter if, you know, I'm just throwing that out there. I guess I was just more curious about the heritage and the practice of those ancestors. And so I was curious about where my maternal grandmother's family is from, where my paternal grandmother's family is from. Did some digging on Ancestry, and I have not yet found how old their families are. Let's get into the DNA. What is my DNA? What does my DNA say? We're gonna look at the ancestral stuff. So obviously the non-American stuff. Let me also say really quick that I was also very interested because my father, turns out, was technically adopted. So the German that I had put so much faith into was like, well, maybe I am, but maybe I'm not, because technically he was adopted. I didn't find this out until I was an adult and my paternal grandmother had passed, so didn't know. And it's unclear to me when my dad found out. And none of this really matters. It's just as far as family goes, right? But I find it interesting. It's just interesting to look back and see what happened and know history. So we'll start off with my biggins. Ancestry DNA gives you a percentage, and then it breaks down. After finding out my father's bio dad's last name, your name is obviously a really big hint as to where you've come from. It's not like gonna set things in stone for you, but it kind of gives you an idea of where your family may have come from. My dad, as far as his bio father is concerned, is a very common name. It's a very common English name. So with that, I was like, that
is gross.
If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike. You know what? You know.
And I say that's gross because England, it's gross as far as researching goes, because to me, when I found out that the name was English and I wanted to do more digging, I instantly knew having an English name was, especially a common name, was going to make the research more difficult for me. That's the first big chunk, is England and Northwestern Europe. Is green on the map. At least on my map, it's not including Wales. Ancestry also breaks down for you, like, where you got your percentages from as far as parents go. And because I knew, like, my mother's maiden name, and because I talked to some of the older people in my family, I know which parent is which by process of elimination. The English and Northwestern Europe, the green bits, are all from my father. Doesn't surprise me, based off of his bio dad's name. Wasn't a huge surprise. So I was expecting to have English. I was not expecting to have 23%, but okay, whatever. Like, the percentages, I was just like, whatever. The next one, my next biggest, really actually surprised me, which I shouldn't have been surprised, but did surprise me. And that's just my lack of knowledge. That's my ignorance, really, on terms of, like, how much Irish history I actually knew. But my next biggest percentage is Scottish, and that is 21%. Blew my mind. Which, now that I look back at it, now that I think about it, and look at things like my hair type, actually, really should have saw that coming too. Actually, I really should have.
Oh my, that's lovely, that is.
That would set us up for months.
Really should have saw that coming. Not to mention how hot I think a kilt is. I mean, come on. I'm joking here. Obviously, I'm joking. We'll get more into the Scottish bit and deities with that as we move on. 19% is Germanic Europe. So Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands. There's even a little bit of, like, the tip of France. Like, a tiny little dip of France is in there. But I have no, like, ancient French percentage. At least not yet. And that's something else that's really interesting about these DNA tests is, as they do more tests with more people and find more DNA, these numbers could update. When it comes to the story that I had heard about my paternal grandfather and where my German ancestry came from, I know that it can be tracked back to Black Forest, Germany, but I have not actually come across those documents yet. So I'm still working towards that, but I was told that we were from Black Forest, Germany. I think is also where the cuckoo clock comes from, or something like that. And then my Irish, which is, I was curious about, okay, I know I'm Irish, but exactly how much percentage of Irish do I have? 16%. 16%, which is less than Scottish.
Oh, saints preserve us. I am getting shorter.
And as an adult, I'm sitting here thinking, none of my recent ancestors came from Scotland. So, but obviously these percentages aren't looking at recent ancestry. Like, your DNA doesn't change just because you've crossed a border, right? So I was thinking, obviously this must mean that my ancient ancestors probably came from Scotland to Ireland, and that's where my more recent ancestors grew up or, lived. And they intermingled with some of the ancient Irish. And what's also interesting to think about is how ancient some of these DNAs are coming from. It's just fascinating to think about. There's also, in talking about this, looking at Ulster, right? Which is a part of Ireland in which a Scottish king sent a lot of people to in order to basically inhabit in Ireland. And that reminded me of when I would research the Morrigan and Cuchulainn, who is, has stories with the Morrigan, and how they're from an Ulster cycle, which is basically just a name for a group of hero stories that were from a particular tribe of Irish. Yeah, so what's interesting, and again, I'm not a professional here, but what's interesting to me, and I'm going to try and explain this from what I'm understanding it so far, and I'm still doing research. And if you're curious about researching any of this or hearing any of this, somebody who's really, really helping me right now is Laura O'Brien. as far as figuring out, like, the Celtic side of things, and I say the Celtic, and I'm using it as an umbrella term, which is shit, because it's just a shit term, but the Ulster cycle side of things, I'm still, like, figuring that out. But in ancient times, you know, we talk about the Celts, and the Celts are really an umbrella term, and the Celts were actually made up of, like, a bunch of different tribes. You can think of them kind of like the Native Americans, how we talk about the Native Americans, but the Native Americans are made up of a bunch of different tribes that have different cultures and different languages and different, you know, religions and all of that, right? Like, we talk about the Native Americans believed this, but it's like the Native Irish, you know, we talk about the ancient Celts, and it's an umbrella term. It's problematic to be like, well, I'm a Celtic pagan, because it's like, okay, but what does that mean, right? Like, what does that actually mean? And because there were so many different tribes had different gods and goddesses and deities, and they understood them in different ways. Which is why I'm like, now I'm curious, because I'm like, so the deities that I work with now are of the Ulster cycle. And that is not from me finding out that I'm Scot-Irish, because I'm like, but I'm curious as to, is that a reason why I'm so drawn? Like, is there, like, a weird ancestry thing? Like, is this why I was pulled to this god or goddess? You see what I'm saying? Like, that's where I'm getting at.
If he were here, he'd consume the English with fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning from his arse.
It's an Ulster cycle, and Ulster was an area of Ireland that was inhabited by the Scottish, and some of, like, Cuchulain's stories come from Scotland, as well as the Morgans, and I'm thinking maybe that's why the Ulster stuff is maybe they have more ancient Scottish roots. It's just interesting to think about. Super interesting. And it's also, I guess, a little bit of, like, you're not crazy. It's a little bit of, like, validating, you know, that I'm on the right path, and my ancestor work, it's just all kind of coming together, I guess. Anyway. Then there's more. So I mentioned that, you know, here lately I've been, like, curious about, like, the Nordic stuff and the Viking stuff, and I'm like, but that's so popular, and it's popular, again, because, yeah, and looking back at Ireland's history, I was thinking, well, it's possible, because, honestly, Ireland is a tiny little island that's been taken over and raided and resettled so many times that, you know, it's a melting pot of different, you know, DNAs and stuff, really. So, considering that the Vikings in ancient times were even in the North Americas at one point, it's not surprising to think that, yeah, I probably have Viking ancestry. Guess what? Norway is at 11%. Norway ties into Norway, but also ties into Iceland on my map here, on my DNA map. Norway is almost completely covered, and Iceland is completely covered. Then I also have a very large chunk of Sweden and Denmark filled. Sweden and Denmark is at 9%, and Finland is at 1%, but takes up a huge section of Finland. Looking at the breakdown, my Germanic and a little bit of my Norway and a little bit of my Swedish comes from my father. All of my English comes from my father. The Scottish, the Irish, a larger chunk of the Norway, and a larger chunk of the Finnish, and Sweden and Denmark. Well, all the Finnish and the Sweden and Denmark, and a larger chunk of the Sweden and Denmark come from my mother. The Viking ancestry is a little bit both, and they just kind of added up and gave me all of it that they had, because mom was 9% Norway, dad was 2% Norway. So they gave me all of that, all of their Norway, which was 11. They gave me all their Sweden and Denmark, and I got my 1% Finnish from my mom. And then, of course, the Scottish, actually my dad had 3% Scottish as well. So he kind of threw in some Scottish too, but he had no Irish, and all of my Irish came from my mom, which is super interesting. I want to go into saying, like, the DNA also traces, like, where your family, like, where in the states your family centered, and it's, like, dead on right. Like, it's like saying, like, okay, you know, Eastern Kentucky, Western West Virginia settlers and stuff, that's where a lot of the Scottish and Irish people kind of settled, as well as with New Jersey and all of that. And, you know, it goes into say, you know, a lot of the Germanic was Indiana and Ohio. It even breaks down that Missouri settlers, and, like, right there, like, a lot of my family is settled in that chunk right there. Just interesting to me. But a lot of us here, you know, will work with your ancestors or ask your ancestors. Start with the ancestors. And we're like, well, what if our ancestors are inherently racist? What if they're transphobic? What if they are homophobic? I encourage us, because now we have DNA. So we really can cut out the whole recent ancestors, younger ancestors, if you will. You can cut those out of the story altogether if you want. And you can pay for Ancestry or something similar, and you can get your DNA analyzed.
Oh, what's that smell? It's bullshit.
And you can figure out exactly who your ancient ancestors were and go from there. And even that's a privilege, because, you know, Ancestry is expensive. I will say that I only did mine because it was on sale for Mother's Day. It was like $30 to get the DNA done and upgrade my membership. So I was like, I'm gonna hop on that. You can also start your, like, family tree for free. Just go by word of mouth for free. Like, you can just ask your relatives details about your family and, you know, record your family tree for free. Or at least that's how I started. I think that's still the case, but I could be wrong. You can cut out most recent ancestors, because I've always been a little bit more curious about ancient ancestors myself, because, you know, the ancients, before colonialism, you know, before the church became a thing, ancient histories were a little different. Ancient pagan histories, homosexuality, for example, was not unheard of. Homosexuality has been a part of the story since humans have been a thing. In fact, that's another reason why I'm doing a lot of research with sexual history as well, which, if you haven't checked out my Sex Magic playlist, we discuss a little bit about, you know, the history of homosexuality and sexuality as a whole, and, you know, how that defines us or doesn't. You should definitely check that out. Even if you're heterosexual, you should check that out. Magic, sexuality, the nature of things wasn't as strictly dissected as it is now. Wasn't strictly labeled as it is now. We had gods that reflected our sexuality, reflected how we look, how we feel, more so than being a being of omniscient perfectionism. And that's the history that intrigues me more. So you'll also find that the ancient ancestors, you're going to, from a medium standpoint, their voices may not be as loud because they're older, wiser because they've literally seen more in the world, and they're unbothered by what you do because they've lived and they've seen all of your younger ancestors live before you. So I think you'll find that the knowledge that they have acquired is just as valuable as your most recent ancestors, and that they'll be more understanding. But that all depends on also your belief as far as the ancestors, and do they acquire more knowledge? Are they stuck? I think that it's my personal belief that when we pass and when we cross over to that realm, we get a choice of whether we want to be reborn or if we want to become a spirit guide or what have you. I personally believe that part of the process of us becoming ancestors or crossing over, part of before we reincarnate or whatever, is that we gain a bigger perspective. And when you gain a bigger perspective, when you see the bigger picture, you see life for what it really is, and you see the truth of everything as to what it was. You see and understand how people felt and why they felt that way, and it's just the universal understanding, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So there's that, and I think that universal understanding, I don't personally believe in hell, but I think that personal understanding and just the nature of cause and effect is everyone's personal punishment. This is getting into a lot, but I'm just trying to say, if you're not comfortable working with recent ancestors, maybe try working with ancient ancestors. Do some research with your most recent ancestors, just so you can figure out who your ancient ancestors are, so you have something to pull from and kind of give you a launching pad to work with. And this way, if this is the way you're doing things, it's a little less like, oh, you don't have that culture, so you can't work with that culture. But also keep in mind that I can't sit here and call myself an Irish pagan because I'm not Irish. I'm not natively Irish. I wasn't raised as an Irish person. I'm just American. So I'm a melting pot. And I guess this is why I also kind of like tradcraft, American tradcraft, because it's like a lot of American concepts, but I don't know. Anyway, I just found it interesting. I hope you guys will too. Please make sure to subscribe, share if you are called to do so. Please leave a comment if you have questions or you want to chat about it, because I'm always here for chat. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and many blessings and love and darkness. And I'll see you during the next episode of Sex Magic. Bye!